The text arrived at 6:43 in the morning, sharp enough to slice through the quiet like a blade. "We'll skip your housewarming. Your sister just moved too." 12 words. 12 tiny reminders that my place in the family was always conditional, always secondary, always negotiable. I stood in the kitchen barefoot, the cold stone floor chilling the underside of my feet, staring at that message, while the Pacific pressed itself against the cliffs beyond my glass walls. My villa, the $6 million home I had built with my own scraped knuckles and sleepless nights, glowed with early morning light, indifferent to the rejection glowing on my screen. I typed, "That's okay," before my common sense could intervene, before my heart could object. And as the message sent, a familiar ache fluttered up my spine. It wasn't shock. It wasn't betrayal. It was recognition. The same feeling I'd had my entire life. Of course they aren't coming. The waves roared outside, relentless and unapologetic. And for the first time in a long time, I wondered what would happen if I finally stopped apologizing for wanting them to choose me. I set the phone face down on the counter and pushed open the glass wall that led to the terrace. The wind rushed in, salty and cold, threading into my hair. I breathed it in, slowly letting the sting of it chase away the softness in my chest. If my mother had meant to sound practical, she didn't. She sounded dismissive, the way she always did when it came to anything about me except when she needed something. The villa stretched behind me, stone, cedar, and glass woven together into the kind of home I once thought only belonged to other people. People with families who celebrated them. People who weren't told to be grateful for scraps of affection. People whose mothers wouldn't send texts like that on the morning of the biggest moment of their lives. But I wasn't those people. And this wasn't the first time I'd learned that lesson. When I was 7, my sister Lila won a reading award at school. My parents threw her a party with balloons and cupcakes, the kind that drew neighbors out of their houses. When I brought home a science fair ribbon the next year, first place bright blue, my mother pinned it on the side of the refrigerator next to a coupon. "Don't stay up late next time," she said. My father didn't look up from the TV. The imbalance wasn't dramatic. It wasn't cruel. It was quieter than that, subtle, steady like erosion. It wore me down one moment at a time. Now, decades later, a single text had the same familiar heaviness. But I wasn't that girl anymore. I walked back inside, letting the door slide shut behind me. The house was warm, humming softly with the low thrum of the geothermal heating I'd installed myself. My blueprint sketches still lay scattered on the walnut table, early drafts of the villa, rough pencil strokes, mapping out a home that didn't exist yet. A home I built not just from steel and glass, but from the stubborn hope that someday I could live somewhere I didn't feel like a stranger. I poured coffee into a ceramic mug, one I'd made years ago, when I couldn't afford matching dishes. The glaze was chipped at the rim. I kept it anyway. It reminded me who I'd been before I carved this version of myself into existence. The villa wasn't supposed to be a secret forever. I had imagined this day, my housewarming, more times than I admitted. My parents arriving, surprised but proud. My father running his hand along the stonework, nodding approvingly. My mother taking pictures, sending them to her friends. Lila asking how I built a home like this by myself. Of course, that fantasy didn't include them declining the invitation because Lila happened to move apartments the same week. I sipped my coffee and walked toward the east-facing wing where the sun spilled like honey across the floors. The ocean shimmered beyond the glass, wild and shining. This house was the opposite of the one I grew up in. My childhood home in Colorado was cluttered and dim, filled with my mother's porcelain figurines and the smell of my father's burnt toast. The dining table always had one seat for Lila, the seat by Mom, and one for Dad and one for Grandma when she visited, and a rotating set of chairs for whoever else showed up. But my seat, it shifted constantly, like I didn't have a place there. Like I wasn't meant to settle. I learned early that when a family makes room for someone else, they don't always make room for you. The villa's layout didn't have a head of table. I'd designed the dining room on purpose, a single long oak table with equal chairs, where everyone sat eye to eye. where no one was the star and no one was the afterthought, where every voice mattered. I ran my fingers along its surface now, feeling the grain beneath my fingertips. I had sanded this table myself, stained it, polished it, placed it intentionally in the center of the home, because I knew what it felt like not to have a seat. My phone buzzed again on the counter. I ignored it. Instead, I walked into the great room where the ceiling curved upward like a cathedral of light. The smell of eucalyptus drifted in from the vases I'd arranged the night before. Every detail was ready, every room prepared, every chair waiting, a housewarming without my family. The thought should have knocked the air out of me. Instead, something inside me settled. Maybe peace didn't always come gently. Maybe sometimes peace arrived as a silence where pain used to be. I stepped outside again onto the terrace overlooking the cliff. The wind whipped harder, now brushing my hair across my cheek. The world smelled like salt and sky and second chances. They weren't coming anyway, I whispered to the waves. They never really were. Then a sharper realization slid into place, quiet but life-changing. If they wouldn't show up for me, why was I still waiting for them? Why not invite the people who always had people who had held space for me when my own family didn't? People who knew what it felt like to be overlooked, overshadowed, forgotten. The thought pulsed warm in my chest. Maybe this housewarming wasn't meant to be about blood. Maybe it was meant to be about belonging. My phone buzzed again, but this time I didn't flinch. I walked back inside, picked it up, and scrolled past my mother's text. Instead, I opened a contact I hadn't called in months. Rachel. I took a breath. "Hey," I said when she answered. "Are you busy tonight? I'm hosting something at my place, and I'd really love for you to come." Her gasp was soft and bright like the sound of light catching glass. "You want me there?" she asked. "More than anyone." And as I hung up, warmth filled the place where my mother's message had left a hollow. Tonight would still be a celebration, just not the one my family deserved, but absolutely the one I did. The first contractor I ever worked for liked to say that adulthood was nothing more than a long hallway of bills, deadlines, and people expecting you to smile while juggling both. I didn't believe him then. I believed him the night I sat in my Oakland apartment, a room so small I could touch both walls if I stretched out my arms, staring at a cup of instant noodles that tasted like salt cardboard and humiliation. The radiator had broken again, hissing weakly like it was giving up on life. Outside, someone shouted at a barking dog. Sirens wailed in the distance. The building shook every time the freight trains passed. It wasn't glamorous. It wasn't even comfortable. But it was mine, or at least the square of rented floor where my mattress sat crooked against the wall. I had imagined moving out would feel like liberation. But that night, sitting cross-legged on the uneven floor with my first paycheck half spent in advance, it felt like something else entirely. Not failure, not regret, something quieter, something like starting over from ashes. The next morning, I arrived at Havenworks Remodeling for my second week on the job, clutching the keys to my beat-up sedan like a talisman. The studio smelled of paint thinner and coffee burned on a hot plate. The others were already there. Jason, leaning against the drafting table, arms crossed over his perfectly ironed shirt. Two junior designers whispering over color samples. The project manager tapping at her laptop. I said good morning to everyone. Only one person answered. Jason looked up and smirked. "The glue girl is here." He had started calling me that on day one after I spent an hour reinforcing a crooked cabinet door he'd installed wrong. I had fixed it quietly without saying anything. I think that bothered him more than if I had called him out. "You know," he continued, tapping his pen against the table, "some people go to school to design. Some people go to school to stick things together." I ignored him and picked up my clipboard. If I had learned anything in my childhood home, it was that silence was often the only safe place to put your feelings. But later that afternoon, while the team reviewed blueprints for a kitchen remodel, I noticed something. Jason had miscalculated the load-bearing allowance for the overhead beams. It wasn't a small mistake. If not corrected, the entire remodel could sag under weight within a year. I approached him cautiously. Jason, the beam load. Stay in your lane, Amelia. He didn't even look up from his screen. We're the designers. Your support. My cheeks burned, but I swallowed the frustration like I had swallowed every overlooked victory growing up. Bite down. Keep moving. That evening, as I swept sawdust off the workshop floor, a gentle voice called from behind me. Dear, is there a reason my kitchen mock-up looks different than last week? It was Mrs. Connors, the client. She was in her late 60s with hair the color of winter fog and an expression that could spot a lie from a mile away. Jason stepped toward her ready with excuses, but she held up a hand. I was asking Miss Rhodes. I blinked. Oh, I made a few adjustments. The angles wouldn't align with the weight distribution, so I reworked the cabinet structure. She smiled warmly. Thank you. Looks like someone here knows what they're doing. Jason stiffened, and the project manager raised an eyebrow at him. I could almost feel the shift in the air, tiny but undeniable. Still, any pride I felt evaporated when I returned to my freezing apartment that night. I boiled water for noodles again, the steam fogging the cracked window. As I ate, I tried to call my mother, not for money, not for advice, just to hear a voice that felt familiar. She answered on the second ring, breathless. Oh, Amelia, I'm glad you called, but make it quick. Your sister just accepted a job promotion. I smiled automatically. That's great for her. She got flowers delivered to the office. And your father printed her announcement to show the neighbors. It's been such a day. That's really nice. And how's work, she asked, but it sounded more like an afterthought. It's fine, I said, even though my fingers were bleeding from sanding wood all day, and I had spent lunch crying in my car. Well, you're always so independent. I never worry about you, she said brightly. You're our strong girl. I stared at the wall, the paint peeling in thin strips. Strong girl. The praise meant to sound loving, but always felt like abandonment wearing lipstick. I should go, I said quietly. All right, tell me if Lila needs anything for her apartment. She wants help choosing decor. I hung up and rested my forehead against my knees. I wasn't jealous. I wasn't angry. I was just tired of being the daughter they remembered when convenient. 2 nights later, after another 12-hour shift, I checked the family group chat. They had sent photos of a dinner celebration for Lila's promotion. My name didn't appear once. I closed the app and tossed the phone onto the mattress. The next morning, an email popped into my inbox from Gavin, my former mentor from Seattle. Saw some of your drafting updates online. What are you building for yourself these days? I stared at the question, unable to answer. I wasn't building anything for myself. Just building other people's kitchens and bathrooms while I slept on a second-hand mattress. I typed back nothing yet. His reply came quickly. Then start. You won't escape your old life by working on someone else's dreams. I stared at that sentence so long my eyes burned. That afternoon, my manager approached me with a rare, encouraging smile. Amelia, we'd like you to take on a small renovation, just a bathroom. Let's see what you can do when you're the lead. My heart kicked like a startled bird. Me alone, your drawings are precise. Clients trust precision. I said yes before she finished the sentence. It was a tiny project, a narrow bathroom in a small apartment in Santa Cruz, but I treated it like it was a cathedral. I worked nights sketching elevations and weekends measuring tiles. When the remodel was complete, the client, a retired nurse with kind eyes, walked into the room and whispered, "It feels like breathing again." She didn't know it, but those words cracked something open inside me. For the first time in months, I felt seen, not overshadowed, not dismissed, not compared. Seen. The very next week, during a company meeting, Jason presented a new kitchen project he claimed full credit for, even though 3/4 of the drafting had been mine. Every compliment thrown at him felt like a needle sliding under my skin. When he paused for questions, I lifted my hand. But before I could speak, he cut me off. Amelia was just support on this one. No one questioned him. Not the manager. Not the interns. Not anyone. The words died in my throat like smoke. Afterward, I walked outside, the crisp afternoon sun burning my eyes, and sat on the curb. Cars passed. People laughed. The world kept moving. But inside me, something finally stopped. I didn't belong here. Not in Oakland. Not in a job where my hands were useful but my voice wasn't. Not in a family where my accomplishments were invisible. That night, I parked by the Oakland docks, rolled down my window, and watched the waves slap against the pillars. The sea breeze was sharp, salty, alive. I took out my phone and searched for something I hadn't dared look up before. Coastal land for sale, California listings, scrolled past cabins, empty lots, unsafe structures. My eye caught on one dilapidated cottage, unstable cliff, Clearwater Bay. Price low, very low. I clicked. The photos were grainy, but the place felt familiar, ruined, forgotten, but still standing. Still standing. My heart thudded. I didn't know why, but I couldn't look away. That night, as the wind whipped off the bay, lifting my hair like a quiet dare, a thought rose in me so clear it felt like truth. Maybe it's time to build something that belongs to me. I didn't know then that this impulse would reshape everything. My work, my life, my entire relationship with the word home. All I knew was this: I was done building for everyone else. It was time to start building for myself. The ocean wind hit me the moment I stepped out of the car, cold enough to sting, but clean in a way the Oakland air never was. I stood at the edge of the gravel turnout, looking down at the crooked cottage clinging to the cliffside like it had survived out of pure stubbornness. The roof sagged. The porch leaned. Every window was clouded with salt. But something in the ruin pulled at me, a silent, familiar ache. A place that had been neglected for years yet refused to fall. Maybe that's why I couldn't walk away. The waves crashed far below, a slow, steady roar that shook the ground under my boots. The for sale sign rattled against its rusted screws. I tightened my coat around me and stepped toward the cottage door, which groaned open under the slightest push. Inside, dust swirled through beams of winter sunlight, sneaking through cracks in the roof. The air smelled of cedar rot and ocean brine. It should have felt haunted. Instead, it felt like a confession. I brushed my fingers against the warped wooden table left behind. My childhood hands once curled around tools in a dark shed, building tiny crooked tables no one wanted. Now those same hands trembled at the thought of building something here, something real, something mine. A floorboard creaked behind me. I turned sharply. A woman in a dark blazer stood in the doorway, hair whipped by the wind. "You're Amelia?" she asked, offering a gloved hand. "Carmen Ray, realtor." I took her hand, feeling the firm grip of someone who'd spent decades negotiating properties no sane person would buy. "You came alone," she observed. "I wanted to see it before I changed my mind." Carmen laughed softly. "Most people don't need to see it at all before they change theirs." She led me around the perimeter, stepping carefully over loose stones. "This cliff shifts every winter," she said. "Some years more than others. Engineers walked away. Contractors walked away. Buyers walked away. The last offer fell through because the foundation gave them nightmares. She wasn't trying to sell it, she was trying to warn me. And yet, as she talked about unstable soil and lawsuits, my gaze kept drifting to the horizon, vast, open, untouchable. Nothing in my life had ever been untouchable. Until now. Carmen stopped at the edge of the cliff and looked at me with a curious softness. "Most people see danger here. You look like you see something else." "I do," I whispered. "What is it, potential?" She studied me for a long moment, her expression shifting from skepticism to something almost protective. "Walk carefully, Amelia," she said. "Some land takes more from a person than it gives." I wasn't sure why, but that sentence felt personal, like she wasn't talking about land at all. We walked back to her SUV and she handed me a folder of documents. When I opened it, my breath hitched. The price really was shockingly low. A number that belonged to a fixer-upper in a bad neighborhood, not oceanfront land, with a view that could silence a storm. "You'll want an inspection," Carmen said. "I know. And a structural assessment. I know. And probably a therapist." Despite myself, I laughed. Carmen raised a brow. "You're serious about this, aren't you?" I looked back at the cottage, watching a gull sweep past the broken chimney. "I don't know what I'm doing. But I know what I feel. And what's that? That if I don't follow this, I'll regret it for the rest of my life." Carmen exhaled like she'd been expecting the answer. "Then let me show you the one thing everyone else has overlooked." She led me around back to a narrow strip of muddy earth that dropped into the sea. The soil looked unstable, but beneath it was something unexpected: jagged rock. "Solid rock, your foundation," she said simply. A foundation no storm had broken. I crouched, touching the cold stone. A rush of something warm rose through my chest, fierce, fragile, hopeful. "This land is stubborn," Carmen said. "It won't be easy. But maybe stubborn is what you need." Stubborn was all I'd ever survived on. That night in Oakland, I couldn't sleep. I lay on my mattress, staring at the ceiling cracks, replaying the sound of the waves, the smell of salt, the whisper of possibility. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw sunlight hitting glass walls that didn't exist yet, floors that hadn't been poured, a table I hadn't built, a home I'd never had. My phone buzzed at midnight. A message from Gavin. "Did you find something?" I hesitated, then typed, "Maybe?" His reply came instantly. "Send it." I sent a photo of the cottage, leaning battered, barely holding on. He didn't reply for a full minute. When he did, it was only one sentence. "This is the place that will change you." I stared at those words until they blurred. He believed in me in a way my parents never had. Or maybe he just recognized that I was hungry for something no one could hand me. The next morning I drove back to Clearwater Bay. The air was sharper, the sky a pale gray, the sea restless and beautiful. I walked the cliff's edge, imagining lines on paper steel beams, cutting through sky windows, catching fire at sunset. I imagined standing barefoot on cold stone floors, breathing in a kind of silence I'd never known. I imagined belonging somewhere. Carmen arrived with 2 engineers, Marcos and Hannah. One looked skeptical, the other intrigued. Marcos pointed at the failing cottage. "If you want to fix what's already here, walk away." "I don't," I said. "I want to build." Hannah crouched beside the exposed rock, tapping it with a small hammer. "This could work if you anchor into the bedrock," she said. "But it will take time." "How long?" "Years." My chest tightened, not with fear, but with clarity. Years meant commitment. Years meant sacrifice. Years meant building something that lasted longer than the childhood wounds I kept carrying. "I can give it years," I said. Marcos narrowed his eyes. "Are you sure a project like this can swallow a person whole?" "I've been swallowed before," I said. "This time I want to come out the other side." Something in my voice must have convinced him, because he nodded slowly. "Then you'll need the right crew," Carmen smiled. "I know people." 2 days later, sitting across from her at a cafe in town, I signed the contract. My hand trembled only slightly as the pen touched paper. When I finished, Carmen slipped the file into her bag, then placed a gentle hand on mine. "Whatever brought you here," she said, "I hope this land gives it back to you tenfold." "I just want a place to stand," I said softly. "You will," she promised. Driving back to Oakland, my old life felt like a coat 2 sizes too small. By the time I reached my apartment, the walls felt like they were closing in. I packed a bag before I could change my mind, tossing in jeans, work gloves, and the old leather notebook where I kept childhood sketches. My phone buzzed with photos from the family group chat. Lila smiling in her new apartment, my parents beaming behind her. Not one message asking how I was doing. Not one message asking where I'd been. I set the phone down and whispered to the empty room, "I'm not waiting anymore." Then I walked out the door. Back at Clearwater Bay, the wind carried the scent of rain. I climbed onto the old porch and stood where the living room might someday be. The sea roared below, strong and terrifying. But the fear didn't chase me away. It grounded me. I opened my notebook and began to sketch walls of glass facing the sea, a kitchen carved from stone, a long oak table with room for everyone who had ever felt overlooked. As lines took shape beneath my pencil, my heartbeat steadied. This wasn't just a house, it was a promise to myself, a promise that I would no longer shrink to fit anyone else's version of me. A promise that I would build something no one could ignore, not because they had to see it, but because I finally did. I closed the notebook and looked at the horizon, feeling the pull of something vast and new. The cliff might have been crumbling, but for the first time in my life I wasn't. And I knew with a certainty I had never felt before that this ruined little cottage on the edge of the world was where my real life would begin. I learned quickly that freedom didn't come with a dramatic sunrise or a perfect moment. It came in small, uneven steps, like the morning I woke up in my drafty Oakland apartment, my breath visible in the cold air, and realized I didn't have enough money for both groceries and gas. I sat on the edge of the mattress, pulling on stiff jeans that smelled faintly of sawdust, and told myself this was temporary. Everything was temporary. Even the version of me who felt like she was always playing catch-up. At Havenworks, the studio buzzed with the usual mix of hammers, chatter, and egos. Jason walked in 15 minutes late, coffee in hand, acting like he'd invented punctuality. He glanced at me sweeping the workshop floor and smirked. Still doing the glamorous jobs, I see. I didn't answer. I'd learned that answering him only fed him. Instead, I moved to the back, sorting screws by size, something he couldn't be bothered with, but would later take credit for when clients admired the organized bins. The project manager, Leslie, handed me a stack of samples. Client walkthrough this afternoon. Jason's presenting. Make sure everything is labeled. I nodded. Jason sauntered past me, whispering just loud enough, make her feel useful. My chest tightened the same way it had in childhood when I was asked to carry everyone's coats during holidays while my sister posed for pictures. Invisible unless helpful. Helpful but never enough. Still, I swallowed it. I always did. Around noon, while the others ate lunch, I checked the load-bearing numbers in the kitchen remodel, again unable to shake the feeling something was off. The calculations Jason insisted were correct didn't match the beam spans. I ran the numbers twice, 3 times. My stomach dropped. If left as is, the cabinets would sag within a year. I approached him carefully. Jason, the overhead beams. If the client stores anything heavy, he didn't even let me finish. Amelia, seriously. Stay in your lane. Then louder, so everyone could hear. Not everyone needs to be a designer. Some people thrive in supporting roles. My throat burned, but I turned, put away the blueprints, and reminded myself he didn't get to define me. Not anymore. That evening, I dragged myself home to the tiny apartment. The radiator was making that pathetic hissing noise again, like it was trying to breathe but couldn't. I heated a bowl of ramen, sat on the floor, and opened my phone. Maybe tonight I thought I could talk to my mother without feeling like a background character in her life. She answered cheerfully. Amelia, good timing. Your sister just got her promotion. Isn't that amazing? That's great, I said softly. We're taking her out to dinner. She's choosing where, of course. Your father is so proud. He keeps calling her our little rising star. I pressed my fingers against my eyes. How's everyone else? Oh, we're fine. Busy. Oh, Lila needs advice on her new apartment decor. Maybe you can video call her later. Sure, I whispered, even though I knew she wouldn't call. Lila liked her victories unshared. And work? My mother asked suddenly. It's okay, I said, feeling the lie lodge in my throat. You'll be fine, darling. You always are. You're strong. I closed my eyes. Strength wasn't the compliment she thought it was. It was an excuse. A loophole. A way to justify the imbalance she refused to name. After we hung up, I stared at the empty room, the peeling paint, the stack of half-finished sketches on my drafting table. I felt small. Smaller than I'd felt in a long time. The next morning, I walked into the studio to find Mrs. Connors waiting. She'd brought cookies for the team and wanted to review her kitchen progress. Jason launched into his pitch arms, sweeping wide like he was revealing a masterpiece. But she frowned, looking at the model. "This isn't what we discussed." Jason blinked. "It's exactly what." She turned to me. "Miss Rhodes, did you adjust these angles?" My heart jumped. Yes, the weight distribution wasn't safe. I redrew. "It's perfect," she said. "Exactly what I wanted." Jason's jaw clenched. Leslie shot him a look. For the first time, the room shifted in my direction. Not enough to make me equal, but enough to make me visible. That night, I celebrated alone with a grocery store muffin. It crumbled when I bit it, sweet, but slightly stale. Still, it tasted like something I hadn't felt in a long time. Hope. 2 weeks later, Leslie called me into her office. I braced myself for a reprimand, but instead she smiled. "You're taking lead on a new project, a simple bathroom remodel." Simple, but lead. My chest tightened with a mixture of fear and exhilaration. I poured myself into it, measuring tiles late at night, sketching layouts until my fingers cramped. When the project finished, the client stepped into her newly renovated bathroom and put a hand to her mouth. "It feels like I can breathe again." Those words stayed with me for days, but reality snapped back fast. During a Monday meeting, Jason presented a design that was nearly identical to one I'd drafted after hours. My stomach twisted as he accepted praise he had no right to claim. I lifted my hand, ready to speak. Jason cut me off instantly. "Amelia just did support work." The room nodded, uninterested. My voice slipped back into the silence I thought I'd escaped. I left the building shaking. I sat on the curb, hugging my knees to my chest while cars rushed by. Everything inside me felt like it was cracking, splintering into pieces too small to pick up. I didn't cry. I was too used to this feeling. That night, trying to clear my head, I walked down to the Oakland waterfront. Fog curled around the docks. The water slapped against the wood in dull, rhythmic hits. The ocean had a sound I loved, endlessly angry, but always returning, never giving up on itself. I opened my phone without thinking and searched coastal land for sale, California oceanfront, fixer-upper. Several listings appeared. Then one, Clearwater Bay. Dilapidated cottage, unsafe structure, price very low. I clicked the photos, shaky, grainy shots of the crumbling place I had visited once, the one that had stuck in my mind like a heartbeat. I stared at them for a long time, maybe too long. My phone buzzed, a new email from Gavin. "Confrontation means you're growing. Confusion means you're close. What are you afraid of building?" I typed back before I could second-guess it. "Myself." His reply came seconds later. "Then build something that starts with you." I closed my eyes, listening to the water hit the dock over and over, like someone knocking patiently on a door. Maybe it wasn't a question of whether I belonged in my family or at my job. Maybe it was a question of where I wanted to belong, and maybe for the first time I had an answer. The next morning, without thinking, I got in my car and drove toward Clearwater Bay. Past the winding cliffs, past the postcard views, to that shaky porch overlooking the roaring Pacific. The cottage looked worse than before, but the land felt like a dare. And I wasn't the kind of woman who walked away from a dare. Not anymore. I stepped onto the porch and closed my eyes as the wind whipped my hair across my face. "Yes," I whispered into the salt air. I didn't know yet if I meant yes to the land, to the risk to myself, or to the possibility that all three could be the same thing. The wind was sharper along Clearwater Bay. The morning I returned, the kind of wind that didn't ask permission before cutting straight through you. I stood at the cliff's edge, staring down at the crooked cottage as if it might disappear if I blinked. The roof had caved in a little more. The porch leaned harder to the left. But I felt the same tug in my chest I had felt the first time, like some part of me recognized it before I even stepped inside. I walked toward the door, boots sinking into damp soil. The cottage groaned as if startled awake. Sunlight crept through holes in the roof, illuminating floating dust like tiny suspended memories. I pressed my hand against one of the beams. It felt cold, brittle, but not defeated. A voice behind me broke the stillness. "You came back." I turned to see Carmen Ray standing in the doorway, coat cinched tight, clipboard tucked under one arm, her hair whipped in the wind. I did, I said. I needed to see it again. Most people don't, she replied dryly. Usually one visit is enough for them to run in the opposite direction. But I'm still here. That's what worries me. She led me outside to the back of the cottage where jagged rock jutted out beneath the soil. The waves crashed violently below, spraying mist high into the air. This is the part no one notices, Carmen said, tapping her boot against the exposed stone. They see the collapsing cottage and the unstable cliff. They don't see the bedrock holding everything together. I crouched down, brushing my fingers along the rough surface. The cold seeped into my skin, but something about it grounded me. This is solid, I asked. Stronger than it looks, she said. Kind of like someone else I'm looking at. I didn't answer. She pulled a folder from her bag. If you're serious, here are the disclosures. Landslides every few years. High winds. Winter storms. You'll need reinforced steel deep anchors and contractors who aren't afraid of getting blown off a cliff. Her eyes softened slightly. This won't be easy, Amelia. I'm not afraid of hard, I said. I didn't say hard, she replied. I said unforgiving. We walked back toward her SUV in silence. She handed me the folder, hesitating just a moment before letting go. What brought you here? She asked quietly. I looked out at the horizon. Something that needed a place to land. That night in my Oakland apartment, the walls felt smaller than usual. I sat on the mattress with the disclosure forms spread around me, soil instability reports, risk assessments, estimates for structural reinforcement. It was overwhelming, terrifying, and exhilarating all at once. My phone buzzed. A message from Gavin. Thought more about that cottage. I took a picture of the cliff and sent it to him. He replied almost instantly. That land is a mirror. Be careful what you see in it. I stared at his words, unsure whether they were a warning or encouragement. Maybe both. The next morning, I drove back to Clearwater Bay, meeting Carmen and two structural specialists. She had called in Marcos, a weathered stoneworker with salt-gray hair, and Hannah, a civil engineer with eyes sharp as glass. Marcos circled the cottage with a grunt. If you want to save this thing, forget it. I don't want to save it, I said. I want to build something new. Hannah crouched beside the exposed rock again. With anchors drilled deep, reinforced steel beams, and the right foundation, you could build something here that outlasts the storms. How long would it take? I asked. A year at least, Marcos snorted. More like 2. I lifted my chin. I'm not in a hurry. They exchanged glances, measuring something in me. Why here? Hannah finally asked. I hesitated before answering, because I know what it feels like to be overlooked, forgotten, but still standing. Marcos grunted. Fair enough. We'll send you estimates. After they left, Carmen lingered beside me. You're really going to do this, aren't you? She asked. Yes. You haven't even heard the price. I don't care. She sighed but smiled. You remind me of myself 30 years ago. Bold. A little reckless. Mostly stubborn. She handed me a pen. Sign when you're ready. I wasn't ready, not fully. But some part of me had been ready for this long before I arrived. I signed. The ink felt final, permanent, like claiming a part of the world that had been waiting for me. When she took the paperwork, Carmen placed a hand gently over mine. Welcome home, she said. Or at least, welcome to the start of one. I drove back to Oakland in a daze. The city noise felt foreign, distant, like something from a life I was already stepping out of. At my apartment, I packed a small bag, jeans, work gloves, a few shirts, and my old leather notebook filled with sketches I once hid from everyone. Before locking the door, I paused and looked around. It wasn't a home. It never had been. It was a stopgap, a holding place, a room I lived in because I didn't know where else to go. Now I did. On the drive back to Clearwater Bay, the sky darkened with approaching rain. The sea was wild, restless. The cottage looked smaller against the storm, a fragile outline against nature's fury. I stepped onto the porch, the boards groaning under my weight, and let the cold wind whip my hair around my face. Lightning split the sky in the distance. The air smelled like salt and endings and beginnings. I opened my notebook and began to sketch by flashlight lines, forming walls of glass, a kitchen carved from stone, a terrace stretching over the cliffside. It wasn't perfect, but neither was I, and maybe that was the point. Somewhere between the thunder and the waves, I whispered to the empty air, "You and me, we'll rebuild." The cottage creaked as if it agreed. Rain soaked the pages, but I kept drawing until the storm blurred the world around me. For the first time in my life, the future didn't feel like something I was waiting for. It felt like something I was building, one line, one decision, one fearless yes at a time. The plans for the villa spread across my drafting table looked more like a confession than a blueprint, lines layered over lines, corrections scribbled in the margins, small notes in my cramped handwriting reminding me what I wanted this place to feel like: strength, clarity, light. Not the kind of light that decorated a home, but the kind that healed it. The kind I never grew up with. Outside my rental apartment, the sky over Clearwater Bay was still pink with dawn when I packed my laptop, notebooks, and a thermos of coffee into the back seat of my car. I had a meeting with Marcos and Hannah at the cliff site at 8 sharp, and neither of them tolerated lateness. Especially not for a build this risky. My hands tightened on the steering wheel as I drove toward the coast. Every time the road curved, the ocean appeared vast and endless and bright. The closer I got, the faster my pulse moved. It wasn't fear. It wasn't excitement. It was something in between, something I didn't have a name for yet. When I arrived, the two of them were already there, standing on the rocky edge, like generals surveying a battlefield. Marcos lifted a hand in greeting. "Morning, boss," he said. "Don't call me that," I replied. "You're the one signing the checks. That makes you the boss." Hannah smirked behind him. "Get used to it." I set my bag on a flattened boulder, unrolled my drawings, and weighed down the edges with stones. The wind tugged at them instantly, as if the sea wanted a look for itself. "This beam configuration won't hold in high winds," Hannah said, tapping a pencil against the frame I'd drawn. "We need cross-bracing here, here, and here." I nodded. I figured. I want everything anchored into the bedrock anyway. Marcos grunted approvingly. "Smart. Most clients want aesthetics. You want survival." I wanted more than survival, but I didn't say that out loud. He crouched and touched the exposed rock. "This stone's stubborn. It'll take drilling, but once it holds forever." Forever. A word that had never belonged to me. I studied the cliff, the waves pounding below. "We start excavation today," I said. "No delays." Hannah checked her watch. "Crew will be here in 20. As they moved off to check the soil perimeter, I stood alone by the edge. The wind whipped along my jawline, tasting like salt and distant storms. The sound of the ocean was deafening but strangely grounding. It reminded me of the nights I fell asleep in my childhood, shed sanding stolen scraps of wood by lantern light, because it was the only place I felt real. This cliff felt like that place, untamed, unpolished, unapologetic. The crew arrived with heavy machinery that shook the earth when it rolled over the dirt. Marcos barked instructions. Hannah paced with her tablet. I watched the first bucket of soil lift from the ground, exposing more of the ancient rock underneath. It was happening. After years of compromised silence and being the background character in my own family, something was finally being built entirely because I wanted it. Not for Lila, not for my parents, for me. Around mid-morning, I opened my laptop on the hood of my car to adjust the CAD drawings while the machines roared behind me. Notifications from my mother appeared at the top of the screen, an unread pile growing more insistent by the minute. I ignored them. They would only say what they always said: "Be patient with your sister. Don't make things difficult. We'll talk later." Later meant never. Later meant their comfort mattered more. I shut the laptop and returned to the excavation pit. By noon, the sun burned off the marine layer, revealing a sky so blue it hurt to look at. Sweat stuck my shirt to my spine, but my steps felt steady, grounded, purposeful. Lunch break, Hannah asked, tossing me a bottle of water. 5 more minutes, I said. She raised an eyebrow. You've been saying that for 2 hours. I unscrewed the cap. We're close to the anchor points. I can feel it. Marcos lumbered over and took off his hat, wiping sweat from his forehead. You work like someone trying to outrun something, he said. I didn't answer. Not because he was wrong, but because he was too right. In the afternoon, we began clearing the last section near the foundation line. The wind picked up again, brushing dust into our eyes. I wiped my sleeve across my face, but the grit kept coming. Storm fronts changing direction, Marcos called out. We have maybe 2 hours. Enough, I replied. We just need the base exposed. Machines hammered into the earth. Stone screamed under pressure. Dust rose in clouds that clung to our clothes. And then, here, Hannah shouted. The drill hit something solid, a deep ringing thud. The hit vibrated through the ground, through my boots, all the way into my ribs. Bedrock. All of us moved closer. Beneath the last layer of loose soil, the bedrock shone dull and cold like the spine of the cliff itself. This is it, Marco said quietly. This is where your house begins. I crouched and pressed my palm against the stone. It was colder than air, older than imagination. Strong in a way I wished I had been when I was younger. Steady in a way I longed to be now. My eyes burned unexpectedly. Maybe because this was the first thing in my life that wouldn't crumble when pressure hit. We anchor here, I said, voice steady. Hannah nodded. We'll need reinforced steel beams and double-depth bolts. Do it, I said. Order whatever we need. The team dispersed back to their tasks, but I stayed where I was crouched beside the newly exposed rock. My phone vibrated in my pocket, over and over. I pulled it out and saw a string of messages from my mother. Did you get our text? We didn't mean to hurt your feelings. Your sister had a long week. You understand that. Why are you being distant? I stared at the messages, thumb hovering but unmoving. Every line felt like a script I'd been reading since childhood. Every excuse familiar, predictable, hollow. I locked the phone and slipped it back into my pocket. Not today. Today, the only voice that mattered was mine. By dusk, we had marked all anchor points. The sun bled orange across the sky, hitting the ocean in shattered reflections. The construction site glowed in the fading light, raw, unfinished, but undeniably full of possibility. When the crew finally packed up and drove off, I stayed behind, alone on the cliff again. The wind nudged my shoulders, cold and persistent. The ocean below churned in a slow, powerful rhythm. I stepped closer to the edge. The exposed rock stretched like a promise beneath my feet. A foundation strong enough to hold a home. A foundation strong enough to hold me. I whispered into the wind. This time I'm building something no one can take away. The waves answered with a roaring crash. And for the first time since the text that morning, I felt something close to peace, a quiet, rising certainty that whatever came next, I finally had solid ground beneath me. The storm hit harder than the forecast predicted. By the time I reached the cliff again, clouds had swallowed the sky, and the wind carried the sharp bite of approaching rain. The cottage creaked under the weight of the gusts, as if it knew its days were numbered. I tightened my jacket and stepped toward the scaffolding we had built earlier that week, boots slipping in the mud. Marcos was already there, hands deep in his coat pockets, staring at the exposed skeleton of the old cottage like it was a stubborn animal he was finally ready to break. You picked one hell of a week to start demolition, he said. I didn't pick the weather, I replied. Sure feels like you did. He wasn't wrong. The storm matched something in me, chaotic, relentless, unwilling to be ignored. Behind us, Hannah walked along the foundation lines we'd chalked out, hair whipping sideways. If we don't reinforce this section today, the rain will eat through what's left of the support, she called out. I nodded. Then we reinforce it. Even in this weather, we don't have a choice. She didn't argue. She understood the stakes. This house had to be stripped to its bones before we could build anything worthy of standing here. I grabbed the pry bar and stepped into the rotted living room. The air was thick with damp wood and old salt. Everything inside me tensed in anticipation. Then I swung the bar into the wall. 2 beams splintered. Dust exploded around me. Hannah coughed through her mask. Marcos cursed as a gust of wind shoved the door open. And still it felt right. Destruction often did. Hours passed. One wall came down, then another. The storm howled outside, slamming against the fragile frame, rattling what remained of the cottage. At one point, the wind hit so hard, the entire structure groaned like a wounded animal. Marcos yelled from the doorway. "If this place collapses, I'm blaming you. Then help me before it does," I shouted back. He grinned despite the chaos and waded in beside me. Piece by piece, we tore apart the house I'd first stepped into, only weeks before. And with every beam I pulled free, every slab of rotten wood that hit the floor, I felt a strange clarity rising inside me. Like I wasn't just demolishing a building, I was demolishing every version of myself that had learned to stay quiet. By late afternoon, rain slammed sideways through the empty openings where windows used to be. The roof bowed dangerously. Hannah climbed onto a beam and looked down at me. "We need to evacuate. Now." I wiped water from my eyes. "One more panel. That panel won't matter if the whole place comes down on your head." She was right. I tossed the pry bar and followed them out as the wind roared. The moment my boots hit the mud, the cottage released a sound that froze all of us, a long, low crack that traveled through the frame. We turned in unison. The last support beam snapped. The remaining structure collapsed inward like a dying thing finally giving up the fight. A plume of dust and debris exploded into the storm. I stood there, drenched, chest heaving, watching the house crumble into ruin. And instead of devastation, what I felt was a fierce, almost blinding sense of release. This was not a loss. It was a beginning. Marcos slapped my shoulder. "Congratulations, you just killed a house." I exhaled a shaky breath. "It needed to die." Hannah nodded softly. "Now we can build something meant to last." The storm faded by evening, leaving a sky cracked open with streaks of pink and bruised violet. The 3 of us stood on the cliff in silence, watching waves crash below where the foundation of my future home now lay exposed and waiting. Eventually, they packed up and drove back toward town headlights, weaving down the dark coastal road. I stayed behind alone on the cliff, staring at the uneven silhouette of the remaining stone and rock. This land had given me truth today. Not gently, not politely, but truth all the same. Sometimes you couldn't build until you burned the old structure down. When I finally drove back to the tiny rental I was using during construction, my clothes still clung wet to my skin. The heater sputtered weakly as I peeled off my jacket. The cottage's collapse replayed in my head, the sound of things breaking, giving way, releasing. It mirrored something in me that I hadn't wanted to admit. I had spent my whole life propping up things that should have fallen long ago. Family dynamics. Old expectations. Roles I'd never agreed to. I'd reinforced all of it, afraid that if it collapsed, I'd collapse with it. But I didn't. I was still here. The next morning I woke with my muscles aching, but my mind sharper than it had been in months. I grabbed my notebook and sketched before my thoughts could scatter. New lines, new beams, new possibilities. A home built on what remained, not on what rotted. Around noon, as I reviewed the structural drawings with clearer vision, my phone buzzed. A message from Mom. "Dad says the storm hit your area. Is everything okay?" I stared at the text, surprised by the concern, but also wary of what it meant. Their interest always came laced with expectations, or strings. Before responding, I stepped outside to breathe in the crisp air. The storm had scrubbed the sky clean, leaving it startlingly blue. For a moment, I let myself imagine what the cliff looked like right now, empty, raw, honest. "Yes," I typed. "Everything's fine. A pause. Then, good. Your sister is coming over for dinner tonight. Thought you should know. A familiar sting crawled up my spine. There it was again, the quiet reminder that their world still revolved around Lila. But something was different today. I wasn't revolving with them anymore. Thanks for telling me, I typed. Then I put the phone away. No explanations. No effort to extend the conversation. No energy spent trying to win a place in a system that was never built for me. Later that afternoon, I returned to the cliff alone. The debris lay piled like bones waiting to be cleared. I didn't flinch. Instead, I walked straight to the edge, letting the wind whip my hair around my face. The land was quiet now, breathing soft and steady beneath my boots. So I whispered, "It's just you and me now." A seagull cried overhead, cutting through the silence. I smiled faintly. Demolition wasn't the end. It was the clearing of space. Space for something better. Something stronger. Something mine. I knelt beside the first anchor point Hannah had marked and pressed my palm flat against the cold stone. This foundation wasn't perfect, but neither was I. And together, we were going to build something unshakable. The first delivery truck arrived just after sunrise, grinding up the cliff road with the kind of tired rumble that suggested it had lived 100 lives before today. I stood at the edge of the construction site with my hair tied back, gloves stuffed into my back pocket, and a clipboard pressed to my chest. The air was cold enough to sting my cheeks, but beneath it ran a current of something warmer momentum. Real, undeniable momentum. Marcos climbed down from the truck, first stretching his back with a groan. "Your steel's here, Amelia," he called out. "And it weighs as much as all my regrets combined." I smiled, stepping forward as the crew began unloading thick, cold beams, each one destined to become part of the skeleton of the villa I'd been dreaming into existence for years. Hannah inspected the bolts, running a finger along each thread as if she could sense flaws by touch alone. "You ready to anchor these?" she asked. "Born ready," I said. That wasn't true, but it felt good to say. It took 3 hours just to position the first beam over the deepest anchor point. The machinery roared, cables tightened, and steel groaned as it lowered toward the bedrock we had exposed the week before. I stood back, watching, feeling my heart thud in time with the machinery's pulse. Everything, the calculations, the excavation, the hard choices had been leading to this. Marcos shouted, "Steady, steady now." The beam touched the bedrock with a resonant clank that traveled through my chest like a heartbeat. I exhaled slowly. "That's one," Hannah said, wiping sweat from her brow despite the cold wind. "One of many," I replied. "Yeah," she said, "but every house starts with one." The morning blurred into afternoon as we anchored beam after beam, the metallic clatter echoing off the cliffside and mixing with the roar of the Pacific below. The work was exhausting, shoulder-burning, finger-numbing, back-aching work, but it felt holy in its own way. Like I was building something not from desperation anymore, but from intention. By the time the 5th beam was secured, my muscles were trembling, and my stomach was a hollow ache. I hadn't eaten since dawn. Hannah tossed me a granola bar. "You need to refuel before you pass out and ruin my perfect anchor placements." "I didn't realize perfection was your hobby," she smirked. "Only when I'm working with people who deserve it." I tore open the wrapper and leaned against the hood of my car. The cliff wind had eased a little, offering rare, gentle breaths of cool air. For a moment, I closed my eyes. That's when my phone buzzed. I didn't check it immediately, but something inside me already knew who it was. When I finally looked, a string of texts from my mother filled the screen. "Your father is worried. Why haven't you called? We saw something online. Are you building a house? Why didn't you tell us? I locked the phone. Not now. Not here. Not when I was finally building something that had nothing to do with them." I slid the phone back into my pocket and returned to the site. But the texts dug into me like cold needles. Not because they asked where I was. Not because they sounded concerned. But because the concern came too late, arriving, only now that they sensed something big happening. Something they weren't part of. By late afternoon, the sky softened to lavender, and we had anchored every primary beam. My body felt scraped clean, exhausted, in a way that made every breath feel earned. "Take a picture," Marco said, nudging me. "First day of real progress. You'll want to remember it." I did. I pulled out my phone and snapped a photo, the steel beams rising from the rock, like the ribs of some giant creature clawing its way into the world. The light hit them just right, gleaming bright against the shadowed sea. It looked strong. It looked unapologetic. It looked like someone finally claiming space. And for the first time, I saw the villa not just as something I was building, but as something I was becoming. When the crew packed up and drove off for the evening, I lingered. The sun dipped behind the horizon, painting the water gold and orange. The beams cast long shadows across the ground. The wind hummed through the site, low and steady. I walked between the beams, slowly, fingers brushing the cold metal. The structure hummed beneath my touch, alive, purposeful. "You and me," I whispered. "We're really doing this." The ocean answered with a swell that crashed powerfully against the rocks. At the far end of the site, I climbed onto the temporary decking we'd set to keep us from falling off the edge. From there, the world looked endless. The cliff dropped away beneath me, and the sea stretched outward like a promise I didn't know how to interpret. My phone buzzed again. This time I checked. A text from Lila. "Mom says you're acting weird. Are you okay?" The message was typical. Lila centered around her, delivered without context, assuming I felt responsible for her comfort. For a long moment, I stared at the screen. Then I typed something I had never typed before. "I'm busy, Lila. Talk later." It was small, but it felt like a tectonic shift. A boundary drawn in steel and stone. I slipped the phone into my jacket and kept walking along the beams, feeling their strength beneath my boots. Feeling my own strength echo back. By the time I reached the highest point where the terrace would someday sit overlooking the Pacific, the sky had gone indigo and the first stars appeared. I sat down on the cold metal, letting my feet dangle above the dark water far below. The wind tugged at my sleeves. The air smelled like salt and rust and hope. I closed my eyes and let the moment settle deep inside me. For years, I had been building for survival. For years, I had been proving myself to people who didn't look long enough to see me. For years, I had been living like a shadow. But here on this cliff, with steel rising around me and the world falling away beneath, I felt something new. I felt like a foundation. Not the shaky kind I grew up on, but the kind that could hold weight. Hold storms. Hold truth. My truth. When I finally stood to leave, the beams glimmered under the moonlight, and the wind carried a faint, almost eerie calm across the cliff. A calm that felt like permission. And as I walked back toward the car boots, echoing against steel and stone, I whispered the words I'd been too afraid to claim out loud, until now I'm done shrinking. The waves roared in quiet agreement. The first headlights appeared just after sunset, carving two pale streaks across the winding cliff road. I stood at the front entrance of the villa, hands pressed against the cool steel handles, the ocean wind tugging at the hem of my dress. For a moment, I wasn't 33 with a $6 million home on the edge of the Pacific. I was 8 again, waiting for my parents to show up at a school play they never made it to. But the car that stopped wasn't theirs. It was Rachel's. She stepped out before the engine shut off, hair blown wild by the wind, holding a bottle of wine, and a look I didn't know I needed, pure, unfiltered joy. "Amelia," she breathed, staring at the villa glowing behind me. "What did you build?" "Something I didn't have growing up," I said quietly. "A place everyone belongs." Her kids tumbled out of the backseat, voices booming into the night. "Is this really your house? Does the pool go into the ocean? Are we allowed to run?" I laughed, opening my arms for them. Yes, no, and absolutely. The sound of their footsteps scattered across the terrace, soft and light, like something healing breaking open inside the walls. Behind them, Rachel stepped into the foyer and froze. Her eyes widened at the cathedral's ceiling, the glass walls rippling with reflections of the ocean. "Amelia," she whispered again, voice trembling now. "They had no idea, did they?" "No," I said. "And that's okay." More cars arrived. Cousin Eli. Aunt Marianne with her tart wrapped in a towel. The older neighbor from Oakland who used to slide leftover soup to me after long work nights. People who had once been pushed aside in their own families and now walked through my doorway with cautious hope, like they were waiting for someone to tell them they weren't intruding. "You're exactly where you're supposed to be," I said to each of them. Inside, the table glowed under soft lighting. The linen runners I'd chosen with trembling hands, the eucalyptus branches. I'd arranged myself every polished glass. Each piece held a quiet intention. No hierarchy, no favorites, no kids' corner. Just one long, equal table. Margaret stirred chowder in the kitchen, humming to herself. Lucas and June tuned their guitar and violin near the corner window. And the villa felt alive in a way I hadn't expected, like it had been waiting for laughter to echo through it. By 7, the room was full. Forks clinked. Glasses caught the candlelight. The children's giggles ricocheted off glass and stone. The fireplace crackled. For the first time, I stood in a crowded room and didn't feel like a shadow. Aunt Marianne leaned toward me. "Your mother, she would faint if she saw this." I smiled without bitterness. "Maybe she will." Lucas began a soft melody, warm and slow, and conversations drifted into softer tones. The room breathed. People ate and talked and leaned into each other like they had known one another for years instead of minutes. I watched them, my chest tightening with something that felt like belonging, but also something like grief. Because this was the table I had deserved all along, and I was the one who'd had to build it. Halfway through the meal, little Ethan tugged my sleeve. "Can I ask you something?" "Sure," he pointed at the long oak table. "Why is everyone sitting together, even the grown-ups?" I knelt beside him. "Because no one should ever have to sit alone." He nodded in the solemn way only children do then, ran back to his seat where his sister was licking whipped cream from the edge of her spoon. Rachel caught my eye across the table and mouthed, "You did this." But he shook my head. "We did." The thunder of waves filled the quiet spaces between conversations. Wind brushed against the glass like a low hum. I walked around, pouring wine, touching shoulders, sharing small smiles with people who had once hovered at the corners of their own families. Tonight, they weren't corners. They were the center. Near dessert, Aunt Marianne cleared her throat. "Amelia, can I say something?" I nodded, though my stomach fluttered. Her voice wavered as she spoke. "When I was your age, I spent Christmas in the kitchen because the main table was full." She paused, eyes glistening. "What you've done tonight, child, it's more than a dinner. It's a reminder that we all deserve a seat." The room softened. Even the children stilled. Marianne's gaze moved around the table. "Thank you," she said, turning back to me. "You made room." I swallowed hard, my own eyes burning. I just wanted us to be together. Really together. As the night deepened, music drifted into something sweeter. The smell of lemon tart mixed with cedar and sea salt. The children dozed under blankets by the fire while Lucas played a lullaby. People didn't rush to leave. Some lingered on the terrace, wrapped in throws, staring at the waves. Others wandered down to the stargazing deck. The house welcomed every footstep like it had been waiting for all of this, for people who didn't need to prove they belonged to take up space inside its walls. Around 10, we gathered for a photo on the terrace. I set the camera timer, ran between Rachel and Eli, and wrapped an arm around each of them. The shutter clicked, freezing the night in a glow of amber lights and salt-kissed wind. Later, when the group drifted into soft conversations, I stepped into the living room alone. The villa was quieter now, breathing around me. I picked up my phone from the counter, its screen glowing faintly. My thumb hovered only a moment before I opened the family group chat, the one usually filled with updates about Lila, her promotions, her new apartment, her lunches with our parents. I uploaded the photo. The caption came to me without effort. "Dinner tonight. Everyone had a seat. I pressed send. My heart didn't pound. My hands didn't shake. I felt steady, certain, peaceful. Behind me, laughter rose again. Rachel teasing Eli about his guitar skills, the kids begging June for one more violin song, Aunt Marianne telling a story about a road trip she took in her 20s. The house glowed. My house, my table, my people. I stepped onto the terrace, letting the wind lift my hair, the sound of the Pacific settle into my bones. The lights above me flickered gently like stars arranged in a net. And for the first time in my life, I understood something simple and brilliant. The ache I'd carried all those years wasn't because I didn't have a family. It was because I kept trying to belong to the wrong one. The waves whispered below, soft and sure, as if confirming it. I stayed there until the last candle burned low, the last story faded into